The truth of the matter is that we are courageous. If we weren't, we wouldn't be here. The honesty of our deal is that we are keepers of the golden, bridge builders to the world. We are the entire planet, every shade of human existence. We are an experiment in there and here and going and then and always in transit. In one blink at the area, you can see heavens and earth turn to see snow-capped mountains, revolve to see a zillion beads of water refract where ocean meets the bay. We speak every language. We eat all manner of crop. We thank our parents in every tone. It is good here. It is good here. We make and export self-actualization, compassion, ideas, engagement, hope. All that to say, we are worth protecting. We are worth engaging. We are worth the struggle it will take to make us our newest and best selves. Every hard conversation, every changed behavior, negotiation, protest, march, or affirmation, we are not done growing. At seeing what we wish was not there, at critiquing ourselves for the betterment of the world. We ain't perfect. We ain't chasing perfection. Ain't looking for hope overnight. What we want is equity. A fair shake for everybody who looks like us and everybody that doesn't. Not just for those who can afford it, but for everyone under the sound of this voice and everyone who doesn't hear too. What we want is access. We want amends. We want livable wages. We want food, bread, justice, land, as we've been calling for years. We want tired, poor, huddled masses. We want to give them safe space and sanctuary. We want all-night dance parties in the Mission. We want the green lush of Tilden. We want women to be safe. We want children to be safe. We want queerness to be exalted. We want our ancestors to be acknowledged, and we want our babies to be free. We know that this is risky conversation. We know that this is high stakes work. But as noted before, we are courage made manifest. We are bold by nature of our being. We are eons into this work and still just starting. We are hundreds of thousands and we are one. We are moving, pushing, thriving. Together, we ask the most courageous among us, the bravest in our midst, to join us.
Hello, and welcome to our second webinar highlighting the San Francisco Foundation's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Ruben Orduña, and I'm the Chief of Philanthropy at the San Francisco Foundation. The inspiring video you just saw is called The Promise of the Bay. The artist is Chinaka Hodge, an Oakland native, a poet, and a former program director for Youth Speaks. This session is being recorded, so if you'd like to see it again or share it, you can watch the recording of the webinar and see it then. During our first webinar, we shared information and trends that we were seeing from the many applicants to our emergency response fund. Today, we're going to be hearing from a few speakers who will update you on our work, share more information about what we're learning, and talk about possible next steps for the foundation and philanthropy in general in addressing the many issues related to this pandemic. Before we begin, a few logistics. Everyone on the call, everyone participating on the call will be muted. We will have a Q&A section after the speakers. Please write your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to answer some of them live with some of the staff that's there, but for those questions that are for the panelists, we will share those during the Q&A. And again, I just want to remind everyone, this session is being recorded. So to get started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, Fred Blackwell. Fred.
Thank you, Ruben, and it's always great to see Chinaka in that video to remind us kind of what we are all working towards. As Ruben said, I'm Fred Blackwell, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. I'm one of join Ruben in welcoming you to our second webinar and thanking you for your support and for attending today. I just wanted to do a couple of things. One is I wanted to give folks an update on kind of the activities that we've been engaged in over the last few weeks, which feel like, I'm sure for many of us, years that we've been in the current situation, and also talk a little bit about the webinar and set up the other speakers as well. For those of you who were unable to attend the last one, and those who actually were as well, the first webinar, as Ruben said, really focused in on highlighting some of the efforts and insights from organizations that are on the front lines of responding to both the health crisis that we are experiencing right now, but also the economic impacts of the shelter in place and social distancing guidelines and orders that we are under right now, and the ripple effect associated with that. And you know, there were a few things for me that came out of that that were really important. One was, you know, we talked to both folks from the faith community and who were working on the ground in the Tenderloin. And, you know, the faith community obviously, for me, stood out as a group of folks who really kind of are leading the charge in terms of leading with morality and spirituality, but also meeting a lot of folks on the front lines. And then we also heard about the challenges that some communities are facing and the real vital link between the presence and the quality and the stability of housing and the ability to really actually shelter in place and keep you and your loved ones safe in a time like this. And I think both of those kind of dimensions of the last webinar highlighted the moment that we were in at the time, and in some places, in some instances, where we continue to be in terms of really focusing in on immediate relief efforts to relieve some of the pain and insecurity that was out there at that moment, and that we continue to experience as a community. And there have been a few ways since then and in that time that we've been trying to be responsive at the foundation. And I just wanted to highlight a few of those and then go into a little bit more specificity around our emergency response fund and how it's been operated. We've really been operating on a number of fronts and with a lot of partners. The things that I think are important to highlight here is that one is we've been partnering very closely with the City and County of San Francisco and Mayor Breed on the Give to SF Fund, which has been very focused on City and County of San Francisco and meeting basic needs both for individuals and families, but also for businesses. We've also been channeling support to an activity that we have been working on for a while called Keep Oakland Housed, where we've been providing information and referral, legal assistance, and cash assistance in some instances to individuals and families who are either on the cusp of homelessness, experiencing a high level of housing insecurity, or on the brink of eviction. It's been an important piece of the work. We've also been, and I've been very pleased with this, at an unprecedented level of collaboration with our community foundation colleagues up and down the state and regionally. So we've been participating in a regional fund established by the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, but also has the involvement of a variety of community foundations in the region, including the East Bay Community Foundation, us, the Marin Community Foundation, and the Solano, Napa Community Foundations, as well as Santa Cruz. And the idea there has been to try to kind of create a regional fund that is responding to basic needs as well. And then finally, we've established our own emergency response fund in response to the current state of affairs. And between all of those, we're really pleased that we've been able to raise and redistribute $25 million, really focused in on a lot of basic needs, both for individuals and families and for nonprofits. For the emergency response fund specifically, $3.5 million has been raised. 262 organizations have receive support, and they've been working on issues having to do with food security, housing and homelessness, as well as worker supports and those folks who are responding to the unfortunate rise in incidents of racism and xenophobia during this period. And you can see from that slide some of the characteristics there. Through all of these things, we have learned a lot. We have had our ear to the ground to listen to different communities and community groups around what's happening, what the challenges and opportunities are. And I think over time, we, just like others, have started to, I think, develop a more nuanced approach to the work and to our thinking around how we can most appropriately respond in this moment. And so the purpose of this panel really is to share some of that nuanced thinking and also share a little bit about where we're headed as an institution. And so to do that, we've got some great speakers who I'm really excited for you to hear from. One is Jessica Mendich, who is our Director of Strategic Learning and Evaluation. This division that and body of work that Jessica leads is something that's relatively new for us. It's a body of work that really tries to focus in on mining what we're learning through our work, mining the data that we utilize for strategy and decision making, and it's really been a really valuable tool that we've been able to add for our work around equity in the region. And so Jessica will talk about some of her work specifically focused in on the nonprofit community and the work that they're doing and the work that we're doing to help to support that work. Followed by Jessica will be Jennifer Martinez, who has one of the best titles that I've come across, which is the Chief Strategy Officer for PICO, California. I've had the opportunity to work with Jennifer on a number of things in the most recent past, particularly around housing and economic development issues. PICO, for those who may not know, is a national organization with tentacles statewide and regionally that really focuses in on kind of mobilizing the faith community, congregations, churches around issues having to do with community. And she's really leading the strategy work there. And you'll be able to hear a lot from her about kind of not just the relief efforts that are underway, but the recovery focused efforts that are underway and some of the things that they're thinking about and strategizing around in that regard. Then you will hear from Kay Fernandez-Smith, who is also has a cool title, which is the Vice President for Policy and Innovation here at the Foundation. And she's been leading a lot of our advocacy efforts. And so you'll hear from her about kind of some of the stuff that we are thinking about and involved in from a statewide and local and regional policy point of view in relationship to the work that we are doing right now. So with that, let me turn it over to Jessica.
Great, thank you, Fred. So I just want to thank you all for being here and reiterate, I think what Fred said, in this moment we are listening as much as we can and in various places. We are listening to our grantees, nonprofit leaders, we are listening to other funders, capacity builders, and all of that has informed how we're thinking about supporting nonprofits in this moment. First, I want to say that this work is really personal to me. During the housing crisis, I actually was at a policy advocacy organization. And I recall what it felt like to go from a world of possibility, where we were fighting for better things for kids, to really just triaging and trying to stop the bleeding. And it was really demoralizing. At the same time, we were seeing our funding cut in half, which had real consequences. Aftermath, one of our first things was to really think about how we're going to put equity at the center of this. and really think about what we were hearing from our grantee partners and what they needed and how COVID was impacting them. And like all of us, this crisis was impacting them at all levels. At the level of person, they were worried about, am I going to be healthy? Is my family healthy? Can I continue to pay my rent and mortgage? They were worried about how they show up and roll. How do I lead my organization when we're suddenly in a virtual environment that we weren't prepared for? What does it mean to lead when I can't hug a staff member who needs support? And then also, the system level, the economy, the political landscape, everything has really just flipped on its ear. And we're really trying to figure out where is there stabilization. We still don't know where the bottom is. So with that in mind, one of the first things we did was really try to think about how do we lift the paywall so that all nonprofits, whether they're well-resourced or well-connected or not,
Well, as usual,
they need to plan for. And
it looks as is often the case, right? When you need the technology to work for you, it gives you problems. Why don't we do this, Jessica? While you maybe adjust on your end, why don't we go to Jennifer to talk about her area of work and some of the stuff there, and then hopefully we will be able to get our technical issues resolved and bring Jessica back into the conversation. So Jennifer.
Thanks, Fred. And I know a lot of what Jessica was saying and was probably going to say felt very familiar to my organization and what we've been trying to figure out how we respond in this moment. You might appreciate this, Fred. It was the day the NBA decided to cancel its season that we realized that this was real and this was going to totally upend the work that we had been planning to do for this year and force us to take an entirely different approach. And so I'll just share a little bit about what we've been doing what our folks have been doing at the local level and the kind of relief response, and then talk about how we think that this isn't only about bringing relief to folks in the immediate moment, but about taking advantage of the opportunity that the recognition of deep, deep disparities and inequity in our society is creating for us to accomplish great things that we've been working towards for many, many years, but now seem self-evident in many ways, in ways that hadn't been true before. So first of all, we, like many others, went to work delivering food, raising little bits of funds and distributing those funds to folks who are most likely were not going to see relief through traditional government sources. Our congregations, which is how we usually work, we go to the services on the weekends and talk to folks and help them make sense of the world through their faith traditions. We were, obviously that's not happening right now. And folks, so we were supporting congregations to reorganize themselves, get online, learn how to reach out to their communities, find those old, dust off their old phone lists and start building phone trees so they could start communicating with each other. That was day one. Day two, and it felt like day two, and it actually kind of was, we realized we can't just think today about the relief that folks are needed or that we need. We have learned over the past 20 years or so through the many crises our communities have faced that we also needed to look ahead, much further ahead even than seemed possible at the time, and start to imagine how do we prepare ourselves against the impending threats, both from the perspective of what we saw and what we're seeing today is renewed xenophobia and other sorts of discrimination, how people might get pitted against each other in the contestation for resources, and how we wanted to confront that ahead of time, and also how we were going to fend off from what is very clearly now going to be many years of recession that are going to be hitting folks, communities of color, African American, Latinx, Indigenous communities most deeply. Not only are folks on the front lines in their work environment, but they're also being most hard hit economically. And it goes without saying. I mean, it's hard to even have this conversation today in this moment without also acknowledging the perpetual violence against communities, in particular Black communities, and other communities of color are continuing, and recognizing that what we're seeing in other parts of the country are part of the day-to-day life of our communities, and those things didn't go away when the news stopped reporting on them. Those things are continuing, and our ability to respond to those issues, not only in the immediate pain of them, but also at the structural level, is required of us. And so we've been doubling down, PICO as well as our partners have been doubling down to say, for structural reforms, what's the recovery of our state look like, and how do we take that recovery to renewal? So we're not going back to the same way that things had always been, but we're actually trying to ask ourselves, how do we protect people in their homes and keep them there? How do we make sure they have resources in their pockets, and then make those long-term changes at a state policy level? These are not new problems. They're just being felt at a different scale and more widely understood for maybe the first time. And how are we organizing ourselves and our partners to think now about what 5 years from now needs to look like, so that we aren't finding ourselves back in the old systems or worse off, which is often the case after a significant both a health crisis and economic crisis that we're facing. To that end, a couple of days after COVID, we started organizing a set of state partners, local partners, community groups, labor groups, policy organizations, philanthropy. San Francisco Foundation has been part of this, to have that conversation and to ask ourselves, what is it going to take to work together in new and different ways? No one organization can do this alone. We all have to be pushing this very big boulder up this very steep hill together. We need to be thinking boldly about what new policies might be available to us that we couldn't have imagined. I mean, the fact that we can start talking about universal health care because suddenly we're all recognizing how important our health is was unthinkable 6 months ago in a real way. And at the same time, we need to embolden and encourage our public leadership to take courageous action and not make the mistakes of the past recessions of focusing in on how we're cutting public schools or how we're cutting social services. This is the time to say we're going to double down and invest in those specific places, because those are the sites of recovery and renewal for our communities. We need to invest in additional housing. We need to invest in childcare and the other things that our families need. So this is, for us, we recognized that there is a 6-week and 6-month plan, and we're also at the same time parallelly to that building a 6-year plan with many of our partners. And we're very happy to be partnered with the San Francisco Foundation to help us do that and make that a reality in our communities.
Thank you, Jennifer. Kay, why don't we go to you and we'll allow you to talk a little bit about kind of some of the things that are happening from a policy and advocacy point of view.
Sure. Thanks, Fred. Again, I'm Kay Fernandez-Smith. I'm the VP of Policy and Innovation at the San Francisco Foundation. Fred shared some of the critical ways we're supporting community at this time, And Jennifer shared and gave you a real perspective on what's happening on the ground to many of our grantees and partners, as well as the call for the medium and long-term issues that our community needs and is based on. As a community foundation, we really believe that it's our responsibility to leverage the various roles and levers that can have the kind of community impact at scale, and also ensure that this economic recovery includes all of our residents and community members. In addition to our donor advising and the responsive and strategic grant making that we're doing through our programs and our COVID emergency response, we also are using our role as a convener and a civic leader to influence public policy, promote the kind of structural changes that Jennifer was talking about that we believe will have long-term impacts on our most vulnerable communities, both during this pandemic, as well as address the longer-term impacts of the emerging economic recession. We're very lucky. The foundation has been positioned to weigh in on key policy issues as one of the most important tools we can use to advance racial equity and economic inclusion in the Bay Area. And our policy priorities align with that equity agenda and reflect really what our community partners like Jennifer and Pico, California have been raising as the top issues of our time in the region. The housing and homelessness crisis that we understand today and are so worried about and are exacerbated by the public health issues and the pandemic is an emergency crisis that we have seen and known over the last decade. And these kinds of issues have not just happened overnight. And so now more than ever, these issues of affordable housing, worker rights, good jobs, education equity, and criminal justice reform are really central to ensuring an equitable economic recovery for all. So with their expertise, their relationships, our network, our staff has been advancing policy and system change efforts in multiple ways, and I want to share a few examples. One way we use our civic leadership role is to convene multi-sector partners. We're able to bring together members of government and elected officials, the private sector, nonprofits, and other philanthropic partners, as Fred described, that are also concerned and working on these issues and the equitable recovery. For example, next week we'll be convening a brain trust of community leaders, researchers, housing experts to discuss what lessons could be learned from the Great Recession and the emerging opportunities, as Jennifer said, to ensure that we can have affordable housing preservation and production at scale, and making sure that our communities are housed over the long term. Fred and I, as another example, are serving on Mayor Breed's Economic Recovery Task Force, bringing the expertise and knowledge from our work, as well as the voices from our community partners and what we're hearing from our grantees to the table. And we also support lobbying and campaigns, such as the Schools and Communities First campaign, which we hope will bring $11.5 billion in resources to our Bay Area communities if passed in November. We see our ability to advocate as an institution where our philanthropic voice can be powerful as a way to support community partners at the local, regional, and state levels. This past state legislative session, the foundation supported advocacy organizations, and we also lobbied in a way that helped to pass 11 affordable housing related bills that we believe will have significant impacts on protecting vulnerable renters, preserving affordable housing, and increasing production of affordable housing over the long run. We also have served as a signatory with other foundations to support eviction moratoria in places like Santa Clara County, so that we know many of our residents who have lost jobs or have had a decrease in their income are able to stay where they're living, so that we're not further exacerbating the homelessness crisis that we face. And another issue we're working deeply on is worker rights. Our grantees represent sectors hit hardest by COVID-19, including the restaurant, retail, personal care, and passenger transportation industries. We're supporting advocates and organizing that are launching an SF UndocuFund overseen by worker centers with large undocumented constituencies that have been left out of the federal relief efforts and can't access those kinds of resources. I hope that this gave you a sense of how the foundation is not only focusing on what's happening on the ground and doing our grant making, but that we're also central to the change in the policy and systems realm to more fully realize an equitable recovery for our Bay Area. We're doing this by supporting policy advocacy at multiple levels, both for the current crisis that low-income communities and people of color are facing. We're doing this through the grant making for critical policy advocacy organizations like Jennifer's PICO California to influence the short and long-term racial and economic equity agenda. And then we're also convening and leading and participating in multi-sector partnerships to address what this might mean over the long term. We hope that all of you will continue to join us in using this opportunity and this critical moment to have a strong voice as an institution and also support our partners in this advocacy and policy change work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. I think that we probably are not going to get Jessica back. So what I'll do is take her time and talk for the next hour and a half. Just kidding. What I want to do, again, thank you, Kay, and everybody else. We will have Jessica available during the question and answer period. Just a couple of things that I would say to close out before we go to question and answer and engage you all in some more conversation. I think the first thing that's important to keep in mind is that we have all seen a variety of forecasts around what an economic recovery might look like. There are some who are optimistic and hoping for a bounce that is as dramatic as the decline. And on the more pessimistic side, we know that there are folks that are predicting that we will be slow in the recovery from an economic point of view. I think what we know is that regardless of what the overall economic recovery looks like, we know that folks who are already loosely attached to the economy, folks who were already experiencing challenges in terms of their ability to make ends meet, secure safe housing and affordable housing, and get jobs that allow them to support their families, will continue to be hurt by this, and that they will be the last to experience whatever kind of recovery we experience overall. What that means is that for the populations that we are working with and care about, this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint, and that we will have to continue to think about what we do to provide immediate relief to those in need, but we will have to be in a prolonged period probably thinking about what those basic needs are, in addition to thinking about what our recovery efforts need to look like and the things that need to happen in order to make sure that it's just and equitable. But as Jennifer referred to, make sure that as we think about recovery and where we want to go, that we're not just thinking about a return to normal, because in a lot of instances, normal was already not working for significant segments of the community. And in that regard, we really need to be thinking about what a more ambitious return looks like for our region, for our state, for our country, and think about and center equity as we do that. And on that note, for us, we established the equity agenda that we're currently working on in 2015. And we did that because we saw that despite all of the economic opportunity and prosperity that was being generated in the Bay Area, that access to all that was limited, and limited based in many instances where people were living, what their family's economic status was, and something as simple as their race and or ethnicity. And for us, we think, therefore, that the agenda around achieving a greater degree of racial equity and economic inclusion at a regional level of scale, and the framework that we've put in place around people, place, and power to get there is more relevant than ever. And in many ways, that kind of agenda was built for moments like these, so that when we think about relief and we think about recovery and we think about renewal, we're centering racial equity, we're centering equality from an economic point of view, and we're making sure that as we attend to the needs of the most vulnerable, everybody benefits. One of the things that I think has been heartening to see is that as we've responded to the health dimension of this pandemic, for the most part, we have seen an amazing willingness of people to sacrifice and to think about others from a community standpoint and protect the most vulnerable, those who are older in age, those who have underlying health conditions, and folks have been willing to make sacrifices for those populations. We will need that same spirit as we move into recovery, as we move into the other areas of response here, so that we're also thinking about the most vulnerable and willing to take on those same kinds of sacrifices for folks who I described earlier, who have loose connections to the economy or who are already struggling to make ends meet or in danger of or already experiencing homelessness. So I think that that's really important. I would close with this, a couple of more thoughts. We're also about to enter a period where local government, state government will be severely hamstrung during a period where we need them most and where the social and economic safety net is going to be frayed, and we will see holes in it as a result of things that local government won't be able to do from a financial point of view. So we're going to need to be thinking about not only what we do in philanthropy and what we do in terms of our generosity, but how do we help and work with state government, local government, regional government to make sure that they are stepping up in the way that they need to step up. And then last, grant making is an important part of our work. The work that we're doing to provide support to nonprofits is obviously our bread and butter, but we think that all tools need to be deployed in this moment. And so we think about our grant making as something that we try to align with our work with donors, try to partner with our philanthropic colleagues statewide and regionally. The use of program-related investments, the use of our own voice are all things that are important as we think about expanding the relief efforts to include recovery, and we set our visions on a different kind of reality and a new kind of social contract at the regional level in order to produce a different set of outcomes. So with that, let me close. I guess I'll turn it back over to you, Ruben, to manage the question and answer.
Yes, thank you, Fred. And thank you, Jennifer and Kay. Yes, please, if you have any questions for the panelists, I invite you to go ahead and enter them into the Q&A section. But I'd like to kind of kick us off with a question to Fred. There's a lot of being written in philanthropy around the response. And so we're just curious, sort of, what are you hearing from other local, regional, national funders about the recovery effort and what they're thinking?
Yeah, I would say, Ruben, that response efforts from a philanthropic point of view have generally fallen into three buckets. One, and we described this in great detail here, there's a bucket of work that is really about basic needs and relief. Food, shelter, clothing, cash aid to those in needs, filling gaps that have been left out by the federal relief package. For example, here in the state of California, there's been a really great effort to include undocumented Californians in the relief efforts. And so I would say that's one bucket. And I would say, for the most part, most institutions early on were really focused heavily on that bucket. I think the second area of work that has been very prominent is, from a philanthropic point of view, we're only as good as the partners on the ground who are engaged in the work. And so there's been a lot of work that has been focused in on the capacity and the survivability, frankly, of nonprofit organizations working on the ground and responding to needs and making sure that they have good support. I've been heartened to see a lot of foundations sign on the letters to reduce the administrative burden, to access grant making, to provide more general operating support, to provide flexibility to those who already have grants to move those things, to move those activities into activities that are being responsive to the moment as well. And so I would say that's a second category of work. And then a third, which I think I've seen pick up more and more momentum, gets to some of the stuff that Jennifer talked about, which is those institutions who are really thinking about how they can be supportive of the kind of transformational change that we have the opportunity to influence right now. Supporting policy, supporting advocacy, supporting leadership development, community organizing, to create both a vision for a different kind of paradigm and a more ambitious recovery effort than just returning to normal. And so I would say those three areas of work are the areas where I've seen most of the foundation activity over the last few weeks.
Great, thank you. There's just a question for clarity purposes that I think I can probably handle. There were some fundraising numbers that were mentioned earlier in the call. I think you had talked about that the foundation has been engaged or involved in about $25 million worth of contributions going to COVID related. And those are, the 25 million are really composed into various funds that we have at the foundation. A large section of that was to the partnership with the city with Give2SF, where we received somewhere like $20 million in that. Keep Oakland Housed was another maybe 1.3 million. And then our own emergency relief fund was about 3.4 million raised. So altogether, it was 25 million. So I just wanted to clarify that point. There's another question. This is also, I believe, to Fred. Have you seen the level of philanthropic support for COVID-19 emergency efforts maintained, or is it beginning to lag a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we have seen is, I think, two things. One is just a significant ramp up in activity that's been associated with kind of, I would say, the last 6 to 8 weeks. But I would say that what we've seen is, I think, the rate of kind of contributions toward specifically COVID-19 things actually has started to slow down a little bit. And I think that also folks on the philanthropic side are starting to more kind of integrate COVID response into their general grant making stuff. And so on the one hand, I think COVID specific activities and funds, I think, have started to kind of wane a little bit. I think what we're seeing is that the result that's partially a result of the fact that folks are integrating it into their just kind of ongoing grant making. There's one other thing, though, that I would highlight here, and this is based on what we saw in the last downturn, is that there actually was a spike in philanthropic activity early on, and then actually 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years down the line, what you saw was an overall decline in philanthropic activity, to tell you the truth, because of kind of declining endowments and things like that. And I think one of the things that's going to be important for us to keep an eye on is that dynamic, because as I said, we're more convinced now than ever that we are in a marathon, not a sprint. And so sustained efforts to really think about relief, recovery, and renewal are going to be really, really important during this period. And I think that includes private foundations and donor advised fund activity.
Thank you. Another question that's partly related to, I think, what you just said, but it's can the San Francisco Foundation increase the spending rate of its endowment? I'm going to ask you if you can respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, let me answer that, but I also want to see if Jennifer wants to add to the answer that I provided on the last question as well, because I know that she's been in conversations and people have been already kind of thinking and planning around what the future of philanthropy is going to look like.
Sure. So, much like we learned a lot of lessons in the Great Recession around in the policy arena, or just how we respond to the crisis itself, we also learned a lot about the philanthropic cycle that we went through in that moment. And I had the inauspicious opportunity to inherit an organization in the middle of that. And so really I felt firsthand what it was like to go through a very drastic reduction in philanthropic support for community organizations, precisely the organizations, frankly, that are needed in the times of crisis of that sort. So we're already preparing for that same cycle to unfold. God willing, it doesn't unfold in that way, and we find other solutions. But I think organizations are already thinking ahead to try to not be surprised or caught off guard by that, and certainly welcome kind of the deeper partnership with our philanthropic supporters to really walk with us through that process as we figure out how to still serve our communities while also recognizing what the economic impacts might be on our own organizations.
Thanks, Jennifer. And Ruben, just to answer your question about spending and endowment during this period, as you know, but many on the call may not, our board actually early on approved making disaster grants from the foundation's endowment. And so we have already increased spending from the foundation's endowment to try to meet some of the needs that are out there. And during the last downturn, the San Francisco Foundation was one of many foundations that increased its spending from its endowment to strategically align with and be responsive to the challenges that were occurring back then. And we will be in that same kind of conversation and posture with our Board of Trustees in the future as well. And so it's definitely something that is on the table for us, particularly in the context of what Jennifer just described in terms of not just the short term, but the long term and what's going to be needed. But I would just say that we won't be looking at just more spending for more spending's sake. We will be really trying to tie it back to some of the things that we're talking about here, strategy around recovery as well as renewal, as well as think really thoroughly about where it is that we think that we can make a difference with increased spending, whether that's around relief or its capacity building and survivability for nonprofits or its transformative change. But it's definitely a tool that will be on the table for us immediately and into the future.
Thank you. There's another related question that I'll go ahead and jump in on that. Basically, the questions are, what are we doing with donor advised funds? And I will say that immediately upon us going remote and the city closing and people heading out, we saw a dramatic increase in the number of inquiries from our donors around what to support, where to use their charitable resources, how to make grants in terms of the COVID-related 19. And we saw an incredible spike in a very short period of time, maybe 4 weeks from mid-March to mid-April, where the number of grants leaving the foundation increased by about 155%. Vast majority of that going to COVID-related activities, not just locally, but regionally and nationally. And then we also saw in the same time that the dollar amounts also increased by nearly 90%. All again, going not just local, regional, and kind of national. Additionally, our team really proactively reached out to a lot of our donors just to feel the pulse, but also to provide ideas of places where they would go. And in some instances, partnered with some donors to launch some COVID-related activities that were of interest in their area. So it's been a very active space there. So let me go to, I think we have time for maybe one other question, and this might go to Kay. But what capacity building activities is the San Francisco Foundation involved in at the moment?
Sure. Jessica, are you still on the line?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and
can
turn this question over to you. I know that you can't be seen, but people can hear your voice, and I'm happy to jump in.
Thank you, and apologies for the technical issues. So, you know, when we think of capacity building, we're really thinking about how do we strengthen and support organizations. And as I started saying, we're doing this in a multitude of ways. One of the primary needs, of course, of nonprofits is figuring out how to stabilize financially. So providing a variety of webinars around fiscal management that will allow them to understand where they are in this moment, do some scenario planning, and look at cash flow management. We are also providing this series in Spanish. And then for our grantees, so that's available to any nonprofit. For grantees, we are also doing more coaching and technical assistance. And we are working with Catch a Fire and Compass Point to really help organizations as they transition to virtual leadership and a virtual workplace. So putting in the systems, processes, and also thinking about what it means to lead in a virtual environment. And then knowing that nonprofits, particularly those that are led by people of color, are chronically underfunded, we are anticipating that and have heard that a number of them will likely be forced into a restructure as a result of lost funding during COVID. And so we are working with the Northern California Grantmakers to set up a shared pool of funding that would allow us to quickly deploy financial, legal, and HR technical assistance to small organizations led by people of color that are really facing a financial cliff and need to restructure. And then the last thing I would say is, given our focus on policy and advocacy, we really recognize that in this moment of COVID, our democracy really is at stake. And so have been working with one of our grantees and Social Movement Technologies to really pilot what it might look like to build up digital advocacy capacity for some of our grassroots organizing nonprofits. Oh, and then the last thing is, again, wanting to support both leadership and well-being. We have partnered with one of our grantees, the Mindful Life Project, to provide a series, a 4-part series on mindfulness. The last webinar is going to be next week. And also in working with Compass Point, they have made a lot of their offerings free at this moment. Again, they really focus on supporting leaders, particularly leaders of color and leaders that are involved in social justice movements.
Great, thank you. There's a couple of other questions, but we are out of time, but I promise that we will get the answers back to everyone in writing as part of our communications. And I would just want to be very respectful of our time here. So before closing, I'd like to thank all of today's panelists for their comments and insights, and to you, our donors and guests, for contributing to our Emergency Response Fund and for supporting other COVID-related funds and activities throughout our region. By all of us working together, we can create a new normal that is much more equitable and fair for all. If you'd like to support our COVID Emergency Response Fund, you'll see a link on the screen that will allow you to do that. Also, if you would like to discuss how you can incorporate or think about incorporating recovery into your philanthropy, I encourage you to please contact us at the Philanthropic Advising Team, and you have the email there. So finally, please complete the short evaluation of the webinar. This will help us design future sessions that are meaningful and useful to you and your philanthropy. So again, I want to thank our panelists, thank all of you for attending, and the webinar is now over, and have a good day. Thank you.